His teacher had never really given him a chance until the day she decided to embarrass him in front of everyone. But when he started playing, her face said everything. She hadn't seen it coming. Marcus Carter sat by the window, tapping his pencil steadily on his notebook. It wasn't out of nervousness, just a habit his mother had always encouraged to help him think. The room at Lincoln Middle School in Little Rock, Arkansas buzzed with its usual pre-class chatter, yet Marcus kept his focus on his worksheet. He liked getting his work done early. Ms. Sandra Miller stood at the front, flipping through her notes. She had been teaching 6th grade for nearly 15 years, and during that time she built a reputation for being strict yet fair, at least with the students she liked. Marcus, however, had never been one of her favorites. She never raised her voice or directly insulted him, but she rarely acknowledged him when he raised his hand. If he answered correctly, she moved on quickly. If he made a mistake, which was rare, she would linger just a little longer, almost as if she were savoring the moment. Marcus noticed that, and so did some of his classmates. "Hey, she barely even looks at you," whispered Alex Turner, the boy sitting next to him one afternoon. "Maybe you've got some kind of teacher invisibility." Marcus simply shrugged and replied, "I guess so." Yet today something felt different. Ms. Miller kept looking his way, not with anger, but with a curious sort of expectation. The lesson began with a standard history discussion about the Civil War. Marcus took notes, listening and waiting for the usual pattern to unfold. Then something unexpected happened. "Marcus," Ms. Miller said in a crisp tone, "why don't you answer this one?" Heads turned. Marcus blinked in surprise. She had never called on him before. He sat up straighter and scanned the board. General Sherman's March. To the sea was a military campaign meant to break the Confederacy's resources and morale. Not bad, not bad," she murmured. It was a textbook answer. A few students exchanged looks, and Alex shot him a questioning glance as if to say, "What was that about?" The lesson carried on, but a shift had clearly occurred. Ms. Miller was no longer ignoring him. She was watching intently. Just before the bell rang, she said, "Marcus, stay behind for a moment," as students began packing up their things. A few heads turned, but no one spoke. Marcus slowly put away his notebook and approached her desk. "I overheard you talking the other day about your grandfather," she said, clasping her hands together. Marcus frowned and asked, "What about him? You mentioned he was a musician." There was something in her tone that made the air feel heavier. Marcus nodded. "Yes, he was a pianist who played jazz." Ms. Miller's lips curved into something almost like a smirk. "Interesting," she said, leaning back and tapping her fingers on the desk. "You must have learned a thing or two from him." Marcus hesitated, unsure of where she was leading, and it didn't feel quite right. "Good to know," she added. As the bell rang, Marcus grabbed his bag and moved toward the door, but then she called, "Tomorrow, show me what you can do." He turned back, confused. "The piano in the corner," she explained, gesturing toward the old upright instrument gathering dust at the back of the room. "You'll play something for the class." Marcus stared at her. A few students paused near the doorway, eyes shifting between them. "Why?" Ms. Miller tilted her head, as though amused. "Why not? Your grandfather played, and I'm sure you've got some of that talent in you." Marcus recognized that tone. It wasn't curiosity or encouragement. It was a setup. Still, he wasn't about to back down. That night, Marcus hardly slept. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation with Ms. Miller over and over in his mind. This wasn't a friendly request. It was a challenge meant for him to stumble and embarrass himself, to reinforce the low opinion she already held of him. But she didn't know the whole story. The next morning, Marcus walked into class carrying the weight of unspoken expectations. Whispers had already started as he took his seat. "Are you playing today?" asked Dylan Reed, one of the louder kids, smirking from across the room. Marcus didn't answer. "I didn't know you were into piano," muttered Alex beside him. Marcus kept his eyes on his notebook. There were plenty of things people didn't know. Ms. Miller entered, setting her books down with a satisfied air. She barely acknowledged the students settling in, her focus fixed on Marcus before starting. The lesson, the first part of class, dragged on, but Marcus barely heard any of it as his mind raced toward that pivotal moment. Then, she called on him again. "All right, let's see what you can do," she said, closing her book and glancing at the clock. "We have a little time before the next lesson." She turned toward the old upright piano in the corner. "Marcus, show us your talent." The atmosphere in the room shifted. Students adjusted in their seats, some whispering, others watching intently. Marcus didn't move right away. He felt every eye on him. His heart wasn't racing, but it beat steadily. Then he stood, and a few muffled laughs rippled through the room as he walked toward the piano. Someone mumbled something that he couldn't quite catch, but he didn't need to. It was already clear what the tone was. Ms. Miller folded her hands and said, "Play whatever you like." Marcus examined the piano. Its keys were old and slightly yellowed with age. A few even chipped at the edges. He ran his fingers lightly over them once. The instrument was a bit out of tune, not by a huge margin, but enough. He took a deep breath, sat down, and rested his hands on the keys, already knowing exactly what he would play. Then he heard it. A stifled laugh behind him, a low, clear snicker. It wasn't just about proving Ms. Miller wrong anymore. It was about showing everyone else that he was far more capable than they assumed. And he was determined to do it in a way they would never forget. The classroom had grown unusually quiet, and even Ms. Miller, usually so self-assured, looked almost curious. The students leaned forward. Some expected a disaster, while others were simply there for the spectacle. Marcus placed his fingers on the keys, which felt familiar, even though this piano wasn't like the one at his home. At home, his grandfather's piano had been warm and cherished, filling a room with deep, rich tones without effort. This one, however, had stiff keys and a soundboard likely warped from years of neglect. With a deep breath and a moment of calm, he played the first few notes, a soft, steady blues progression, the kind his grandfather used to play on humid Arkansas afternoons. Marcus's fingers moved with confidence. His left hand kept the beat while his right danced over the melody. The classroom fell silent. The whispers stopped. Even the kids who had smirked earlier now sat frozen. Ms. Miller crossed her arms, her eyebrows slightly furrowing. She had expected hesitation, perhaps a shaky start. But instead, she was hearing something entirely unexpected. Marcus wasn't playing for them anymore. He was playing for himself, for his grandfather. He allowed himself to get lost in the music, each note telling a story that only he could understand, as his fingers glided effortlessly across the keys. Striking a balance between precision and raw emotion, it wasn't just about technical skill. It was like having a real conversation with the piano. Then he took a risk, shifting into a more complex piece, letting his hands weave intricate runs up and down the keyboard, a progression his grandfather had taught him, one he had struggled with for months before finally nailing it. A deep, rolling bass pulsed beneath a soaring melody as notes collided and resolved in perfect harmony. The longer he played, the heavier the silence in the room became. That silence settled over everyone like the very notes filling the space. No one laughed. Alex, sitting near the front, leaned forward with wide eyes. Dylan, who had cracked a joke earlier, now sat silently with his arms crossed. A few other students exchanged glances, their faces a mix of shock and something akin to admiration. Then came the crescendo. Marcus's fingers pressed firmly against the keys, striking chords that echoed off the walls. The music swelled, filling every corner of the room and seeping into every quiet space where doubt once resided. He pushed harder, letting his final run carry the weight of everything unsaid. Then, silence. The last note hung in the air for a moment, before fading away. Marcus slowly lifted his hands, resting them on his lap. For a brief second, nobody moved or spoke. Then a single clap emerged from the back, followed by another and yet another, until the entire class burst into applause. Alex let out a low whistle. "Man, I didn't know you could do that," while Dylan shook his head slightly. Marcus exhaled deeply, his heart pounding, not from nerves, but from the raw energy of what had just occurred. He had done more than just play music. He had changed something. The applause grew as students exchanged looks, as if they had witnessed something they weren't meant to see, something they would remember. Yet the loudest silence came from Ms. Miller. Her face was unreadable as she stood by her desk, arms folded and lips pressed tightly together. The clapping continued around her, but she remained still and silent. Marcus sat there with his hands resting on his lap, breathing slowly. He wasn't smiling or seeking approval. He just let the moment linger, allowing everyone to absorb what had happened. Finally, Ms. Miller broke the silence. "Well," she said in a clipped tone, "that was unexpected." As the applause subsided, students glanced between her and Marcus, with a few still, whispering excitedly. Yet the energy in the room had clearly shifted. It wasn't just about putting on a show anymore. "Where did you learn to play like that?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. Marcus met her steady gaze and replied, "My grandfather." For an instant, something flickered across her face, but it vanished too quickly to name. She straightened up and said, "I see." After a pause, Ms. Miller tapped her fingers on the desk, the only sound in the now hushed classroom. Then, as if dismissing what had just happened, she turned to the rest of the students and said, "All right, let's get back to our lesson." Though nobody moved, Marcus looked around. Alex was still watching him with raised eyebrows, while a girl at the back, Sierra James, seemed almost annoyed, as though the moment had been snatched away too soon. Dylan muttered under his breath, "That's it?" And Ms. Miller snapped, "Excuse me?" Dylan shrugged and replied, "I mean, that's all you're gonna say? He just played like some act on TV and you're just moving on?" A few heads nodded in agreement. Ms. Miller's face hardened. "This is a classroom, not a talent show." Marcus took a steadying breath. "You didn't think I couldn't play, did you?" she said sharply, her eyes darting to him in a challenging manner. He met her gaze evenly. "That's exactly why you called me up here." A few murmurs rippled through the room as Ms. Miller exhaled slowly. "I simply gave you an opportunity to share your talent with the class." Marcus shook his head. "No, you didn't. Even if you thought I'd mess up, you still asked me." More whispers spread as Ms. Miller's fingers curled slightly on the edge of her desk. "That is enough, Marcus," she ordered, but he wasn't finished. "You wouldn't have asked Alex," he continued, glancing at his friend, or Sierra, or Dylan, "if you hadn't noticed how the whole room was holding its breath." Ms. Miller's jaw twitched as she retorted, "You're out of line. I do not think I am." Her eyes darkened, and her posture stiffened. "Sit down," she commanded for the first time that day. Marcus hesitated, then looked around at his classmates, the ones who had ignored him before, the ones who had underestimated him, and those who had smirked when she called his name. Slowly, he stood, and the silence in the room grew even heavier and more charged. Ms. Miller, usually so in control, now appeared a bit shaken. This time, she wasn't the one dictating the mood. Marcus walked back to his seat slowly, feeling the weight of every step. His heart no longer pounded with anxiety. Instead, a strange calm had settled over him. He sat down, still aware of every pair of eyes on him. Alex gave him a subtle nod, a nod that needed no words, while Sierra continued to watch Ms. Miller closely. With her arms still crossed, as if expecting more, Ms. Miller turned her attention back to her lesson plan, eyes fixed on the page as though she could pretend nothing had happened. "Let's move on," she said. But the room didn't instantly return to normal. The energy lingered. People continued whispering. It wasn't just about the music anymore. Dylan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, remarking, "It's kind of strange how you're not talking about it." Ms. Miller's eyes snapped up. "Excuse me?" Dylan shrugged. "You made such a big deal out of him playing, and now you act like nothing happened." A few quiet agreements rippled through the room as Ms. Miller's grip on her book tightened. That is enough. Yet Marcus had seen the hesitation, the discomfort, and so had everyone else. For the rest of the class, Ms. Miller's usual authority felt diminished, as if a sturdy glass window had just been cracked. She continued to run the lesson, but the students were no longer as engaged. The familiar rhythm was gone. When the bell finally rang, chairs scraped against the floor as students packed their things, murmuring softly as they filed out. Marcus slung his bag over his shoulder and headed for the door. Just before he stepped out, Ms. Miller called, "Marcus?" He turned back for a moment. She looked as if she might say something sincere, but her expression hardened. "I hope you understand that this is still my classroom." Marcus studied her for a moment. Then, in the same calm, steady voice he had maintained earlier, he said, "I understand." A brief silence passed between them before he walked into the hallway. Alex caught up with him. "Bro, what was that about? You just turned everything upside down." Marcus exhaled deeply. "Yeah," he replied. Alex nudged his shoulder. "So, are you going to play again?" Marcus thought for a moment about the feel of the keys under his fingers and the music that had filled the room, then smiled. "Yeah, I think I will." Because today he hadn't just played music, he had been truly heard. That afternoon, Marcus walked home feeling lighter. The sun hung low over West Markham Street, casting long shadows as he made his way along the familiar path. The burden he had carried since yesterday, the tension and doubt, was finally gone. At the corner store in his neighborhood, he stopped to grab a bottle of water. Mr. Roberts, the older man who ran the shop, gave him a knowing look. "You look like a kid who just did something important." Marcus paused and then smiled. "Maybe I did." By the time he reached home, the aroma of fried catfish and cornbread filled the air. His mother was at the stove, humming as she flipped something in a pan. "You're home late," she remarked as Marcus dropped his bag by the door. He sat down at the kitchen table after what had been a long day. His mother glanced over her shoulder and asked, "So, was it good or bad?" Marcus thought about it, the way the classroom had gone silent, the way Ms. Miller had looked at him, the way his classmates had finally seen him for who he really was. "Good," he said softly. "Really good." His mother turned off the burner, wiped her hands on a dish towel, and sat down across from him. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked. Marcus nodded, and for the next 15 minutes, he told her everything. She listened intently, never interrupting or rushing him. Her expression shifted between concern, pride, and something softer, almost a hint of sadness. When he finished, she exhaled and said, "Sounds like you made her uncomfortable." "I think I did," Marcus replied calmly. "And how do you feel about that?" His mother smiled and reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "Good." The next day at school, things felt different. Not dramatically so. Ms. Miller still ran her class the same way, still called on the same students, still acted as though nothing had changed. But the energy in the room had shifted. People now saw her differently, and they saw Marcus in a new light too. During lunch, a few students who had never spoken to him before gathered around his table. "Man, you were incredible on that piano," said Sierra, sitting across from him. "How long have you been playing?" "Since I was 5, Marcus replied. Alex shook his head. "Man, you've been holding out on us." Marcus smirked. "Guess so." Across the cafeteria, Ms. Miller passed by with a tray in hand. Their eyes met briefly, This time she looked away first, and Marcus simply kept eating, because he had already said everything he needed to say. Some lessons aren't taught in textbooks. Some moments change the way people see the world, whether they want to or not. Ms. Miller had spent the entire year overlooking Marcus, and in just a few minutes, he had made sure she would never do that. Again, maybe she would never admit it aloud or acknowledge what she had assumed, but it didn't matter, because now Marcus knew something she didn't. When people try to silence you, when they try to underestimate you, the best thing you can do is let your talent speak louder than their doubts, and when you do that, they have no choice but to listen. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe, because sometimes the most powerful stories remind us to stand tall, no matter who is watching.